we'll do is we'll have each panelist speak for a few minutes. How many minutes I've left to them because I trust them fully with the time of the session. So we can start in the middle. Lisa, why don't you start?
Well, thank you very much. Thanks to CII for inviting me here to speak today. It's really an honor to be with such esteemed panelists, Ambassador Kumar, Dr. Tellis, and Mr. Gupta. So we're here talking about the importance of the Indo-Pacific region, how that's connected to Russia, and what are the policies that the U.S. and India can pursue together in this important region. So certainly the Indo-Pacific region is becoming the world's economic and geopolitical center of gravity. There's no debating that. 60% of the world's population, 35% of the world's GDP is becoming a major driver of the world economy. It's also become the central area of competition between the United States and China. This is clear with the recent national security strategy that the United States released, and the U.S. strategy of enhancing its partnerships with allies and partners, having overlapping networks of partnerships to work on issues and to counter challenges like maritime aggression, gray zone activity, preventing the misuse of technology for authoritarian purposes, and fulfilling the region's vast infrastructure needs. These are all things that the U.S. and India are working on together. Now, of course, we had major provocations by China this past August with its live fire drills and large-scale military exercises, crossing the median line that separates China and Taiwan. This happened repeatedly, China trying to establish a new normal that doesn't recognize Taiwan and its territorial sovereignty. So, and similarly, Russia invading Ukraine in February. We just can't deny that these two theaters are interrelated. And of course, Russia's invasion of Ukraine following the no limits partnership that was declared between Russia and China just a couple weeks before the invasion. So I think, India plays a central role in every country's Indo-Pacific strategy. For instance, Canada just released an Indo-Pacific strategy, which was actually quite impressive. Canada committing $2.3 billion over 5 years to the region, and India is a focal point of that strategy. So, whether it's the US, EU, South Korea, ASEAN, let's just say a lot is riding on India to help maintain a free and open Indo-Pacific. There's much India can do and is already doing. India's participation in the Quad is extremely critical. We wouldn't have a Quad without India, obviously. And the Quad has made remarkable progress in the last 5 years. If you would have told me 5 years ago, when I was at the NSC and involved in reviving the Quad, how far the grouping would have come, I wouldn't have believed it. It's just remarkable what has been achieved there. So I think just in conclusion, we can say that how India manages its relationships with both Russia and China in the coming years will be a critical factor in determining how the U.S. competition plays out and whether the world can count on a rules-based order that has been in place since the end of World War II. So, I know India is carefully managing its relationship with China. But, it's an understatement to say that India's foreign policy choices in the coming years will be extremely consequential to this overall world order. And I think that as India seeks to maximize its strategic options, it's in India's interest to reduce its military dependence on Russia. I know this is starting to happen already, but I think it needs to pivot more rapidly to open up its options and rely on other defense suppliers. And that's simply because Russia is going to be a less reliable partner for India moving forward. I was recently at a conference which was focused on Central Asia, and it's clear that Russia is losing influence in its own backyard in Central Asia because of its aggression against Ukraine. So we're really seeing tectonic geopolitical shifts occurring right now, and India is really in the center of what is happening. And I think that India's strategic partnership with the United States, the burgeoning Quad cooperation, really are increasing India's strategic choices. So let me just leave it there. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's very interesting and very precise, gives us many talking points and many threads to pick. I noted that you talked about what the Chinese have done across Taiwan Straits, but that's more a show of force and more sort of display of firecrackers. They've done something more substantive and something that led to the loss of life on our borders. So with India, they've gone beyond just saber rattling or beyond sort of posturing. So they've done some real stuff there, and they haven't gone back. Not only have they not gone back, they are actually now digging in as if they are there in permanent basis. So the Chinese are doing their stuff across their borders, and those who share land borders have a particular problem because they don't have the distance of any seas between them, any water between them. The other thing, you raised a very important point of how India needs to calibrate its relationship with Russia. And that's where we found a certain degree of prickliness coming out of New Delhi, particularly with the Europeans, when they tend to be, I don't think the Europeans, that's my view, and I'm sort of sticking it in. Europeans have quite tried to understand India or where India comes from strategically almost for 60, 70 years now. And this is a quick new discovery. So those are issues that I think that will give us much to think about. Ambassador Mohan Kumar, if you have the floor now.
Thank you very much for the opportunity. And I will be brief, and I can take off from where Lisa.
So was Lisa. You can't accuse her for not being brief.
Yes. So
that will be too brief.
Okay. So let me say my piece. Thank you. No, I will merely begin by saying that I honestly believe that the Russian war in Ukraine will impact Indian foreign and security policy in a way that the disintegration of Soviet Union and the Chinese aggression in Ladakh, these two seminal events led to adjustments in Indian foreign policy. I want to say categorically that I do believe the Russian war in Ukraine will do the same in terms of consequences, and we can discuss this. Politically, I believe the United States now faces a two-front strategic challenge. Before the Russian war in Ukraine, the focus was on China. Now it has Russia and China. And I'm going to be a little provocative to say that I do not believe at this point that the United States has the bandwidth or the political will to do both. So it will need the assistance, support of allies and friends. Now that puts India in a difficult situation because we thought the focus will be on China. And the Russian war in Ukraine has detracted a little bit from that. And that is something I think we should accept. That I think leads India in very interesting ways. And I'm happy to discuss this in the question and answer session. One of the things that it does is, I think what Lisa said, it has to increase its strategic choices. I think one way to do it is my old place where I was ambassador. We can try and do things with France. Now that other countries have also announced their Indo-Pacific policy, we can try and really try to see if we can really spread our bets, if you like. But this is a point on which I would be interested in the views of both Dr. Tellis and Lisa Curtis, whether you agree with me that the US does not have the bandwidth and the political will and the interest to take on both at the same time. So that is the first. The second, I would say, is economic. And this is an area where I feel now that trade is becoming strategic, reciprocal, and preferential. We are no longer in a WTO regulated, MFN based international trade. So I believe very strongly that it's not enough for India to just join the 3 pillars of IPEF, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework Agreement for Prosperity. They must join the trade pillar. India has made an important shift after looking east, and all of our FTAs were to the east until recently. All our FTAs now are to the west, with the exception of Australia, which nominally you can say is also part of the West. I think that is an important shift. And I think it's a shift which must reach its logical conclusion. I know an FTA with the United States is virtually impossible. There is no traction in the United States for an FTA, but we must do the next best thing, which is India should join the trade pillar. So that is as far as economics trade is concerned. There is a lot more we can do as well. Lastly, security, and I think Lisa is spot on. This is the one thing which worries me the most. I've been talking to some retired generals. I underline the word retired. I have not talked to serving generals, and I'm not sure they will be able to speak in a very frank fashion. I've heard figures of 20 years. This is the time that a lot of people tell me to really reduce this enormous dependence on Russian weapons, whether it is Army, Air Force, or Navy. So this is something that is important for India, because I don't know at the end of the war what kind of a country Russia will be, and whether it is quite apart from its willingness to do so, its ability to keep supplying the weapons that we want has to be looked at by India if you want to be objective and rational about it. So I will conclude, Mr. Chairman, by just saying that the Russian war in Ukraine has done 2 very conflictual things for Indian foreign policy. On the one hand, I think we were in a situation where we were accelerating our participation in Quad and trying to do things with United States, Australia, Japan. And then this Russian war in Ukraine intervenes. It completely upends our calculus, in my view. And so now we are left a little bit back, not exactly back to square one, but we are now back to a little bit of strategic hedging. So we will have to reassure Russia. We will have to talk to China, in my view, at some point. Because, as you rightly said, Mr. Chairman, it's a neighbor, a long border, we will see. But I think, therefore, India has an issue, really. There is residual angst or residual irritation in America because we have not condemned Russia. So we have to handle that as well. So all in all, I think the strategic calculus before the Russian intervention in Ukraine and after the Russian intervention in Ukraine for India is clearly different. And that is something that we have to work with, but I'm happy to expand on this. Thank you again.
Well, that's a very sound point, because you know what, when your adversaries do nutty things, you feel vindicated. See, that's the reason he's my adversary. When your friends do nutty things, it leaves you very confused, and it leaves you searching for options. And then what options do you look for when your friends have done this? You can't even go and complain to somebody. So that's the kind of situation that Russia has put India in, and you put it in great bit of detail. Ashley, you say your piece, but you really buy into this idea that Americans might be disappointed that India hasn't condemned Russia. Does anybody in America, forget what people might say, because they formally have to say this, but would you think that anybody in the American policy-making structure actually seriously expects India to condemn Russia at this point?
Thank you, Shekhar. I'm delighted to be here with Lisa and Mohan, and I want to thank CII, as all of us have done, for inviting me. I will address your question at the end, but let me start by making a few points about the broad topic itself, which is the impact of the Russian-Ukraine war on the broader Indo-Pacific. The first point I want to make is that what the Russians have done in Ukraine is certainly calamitous for both global order as well as European security. We thought the problems of European security were essentially resolved after the Cold War. This invasion is a very rude reminder that the problems of European security were not resolved. The architectures that were put in place after the Cold War did not solve one fundamental problem, which is integrating Russia into the new evolving Europe. And today we are seeing the consequences of the failure of that European integration project where Russia is concerned. I say this not to blame anyone, but to simply make the point that the developments of the last 30 odd years essentially exacerbated Russia's fears about developments on its own borders. And when those fears were married to the imperial ambitions of someone like Vladimir Putin, you essentially got the kind of crisis that we have in Europe today. Having said that, it's actually odd that the consequences of this Russian invasion of Ukraine have actually not been as striking in terms of their effects on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that is because Russia was always a peripheral actor in Asia. It had some role to play during the Cold War. But after the Cold War ended, Russia's engagement in maritime Asia was relatively peripheral. And this war only will make Russia even more peripheral to the Indo-Pacific. And I want to pick up on a theme that both Lisa and Mohan mentioned here. That is, what we are going to see at the end of this process is a structural weakening of Russia. That is going to be first very catastrophic for the Russians themselves, but for India as well, because India always had a dream of balancing China through the creation of a multipolar architecture in Asia. And essentially what this war has done is that it has pushed Russia from being a meaningful pole in the Asian geopolitical context for at least quite some time to come. So the number of great powers actually who will play a role in balancing China are actually smaller today than they were before Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And this is a structural development in the region that I think has enormous consequences for India. Of course, there are challenges with respect to Russia as an arms supplier and so on and so forth. But I think the challenges are even more profound because India will lose Russia as a meaningful supplier of advanced military equipment at a time when it actually does not have easy substitutes. And we tend to talk, sometimes very loosely that the United States and Europe and others could substitute for the Russians. But that substitution is going to be extremely hard for several reasons. First, the prices of Russian arms have been relatively cheaper compared to those of their Western counterparts. And that was an important incentive for India to go Russian over the last 50 odd years. It cannot simply substitute European and Western arms for Russian arms simply on economic grounds. Two, the Russians were extremely liberal with respect to transfers of technology and production of those arms in India. Western suppliers will find it harder to replace Russia in that context because the economics of Western arms production is very different from the economics of Russian arms production, which is essentially production through a state-owned enterprise. And third, the Russians have been in the past willing to support India's strategic programs. at a time when the West, despite growing proximity to India, has been relatively reluctant to do so. And so the fact that India might lose Russia as a strategic partner in a broader sense is going to put India in a very awkward situation in the years to come. So I want to say that about Russia, because those are long-term consequences that India will have to deal with, which are not going to be easy to manage. The second point I want to make is about China. There is nothing in the Russian-Ukraine invasion that is going to lead to a broad shift in China's strategic direction. China will continue to grow in power, not as fast as it has done in the last 2 decades, but it will have incremental growth, which will still make it a significant player. And in fact, the most significant player in the Indo-Pacific outside the United States. And so one has to live with the realities of rising Chinese power and the fact that this power, the slope of that growth may taper, but the direction of that growth will not be fundamentally unchanged. And so I expect that Chinese assertiveness in different dimensions will continue to remain fairly pronounced. But there is a big asterisk. The asterisk is really the difference in Chinese reactions in the maritime space versus China's reactions in the continental space. What the Russian-Ukraine invasion has done for China is that it has sobered China in some very important ways. China recognizes that any attempts at wanton aggression in the maritime realm will now have to take into account the realities of Western solidarity, which were not very visible prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It will have to take into account the terrific coercive power of the West, especially in the realm of economics. And it's something that Mohan alluded to when he talked about the evolution of trade. And the Chinese have also begun to be very attuned to the reality of the risks of too close an alliance with Moscow. So when it comes to the maritime space, I think the Chinese have learned the lesson that precipitate military action is actually a highly risky endeavor, especially in warfighting arenas where the Chinese do not have comparative advantage. Now, in the continental space, the story is somewhat different, because the Chinese do have a comparative advantage in land warfare. The only wars that China has fought since 1949 have essentially been land wars. And therefore, the risks that poses to India in the years to come are going to remain significant. I think what we have seen starting in May of 2020 is going to be prolonged for a very long time. I do not expect a rapid resolution of any of the fundamental issues on the border. And so India will have to deal with the realities of this China. The third point I want to make is about the United States, and I want to touch on some of the issues that Mohan raised. I think the United States has no choice but to deal with the European theater and the Indo-Pacific theater simultaneously. You cannot be a great power, much less a hegemonic power in the international system that essentially bears your name, and say that I'm going to pick and choose between two central theaters of action in the global system. The US may prefer to prioritize the Indo-Pacific. There's no doubt about that. But it simply will not have the luxury of saying, I'm going to focus on Europe to the neglect of the Indo-Pacific, or I'm going to focus on the Indo-Pacific to the neglect of Europe. Great powers have to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time. And the United States is eminently capable of doing that. The bigger challenges that we are going to face are issues of resource mobilization. And to be very honest, we have not demonstrated a striking record of success with respect to resource mobilization. Two, we are going to have to deal with the deep divisions in our own society about the role that the United States must play in the world. And it is entirely possible that if we don't manage those divisions, we will end up being frustrated in our hegemonic responsibilities, not by challenges from the outside, but by challenges from the inside. And third, we are going to have to do some serious rebuilding of our military capabilities. I mean, what this war in Ukraine has shown is how an assistance program, mind you, we're not fighting a war actively. There are no US troops in the field, but how merely an assistance program has depleted US warfighting stockpiles within a matter of months, especially advanced weapons, which we have transferred to the Ukrainians. So if we are serious about dealing with the Chinese challenge as a result of the Ukraine war, we are going to have to do some serious plussing up of our defense budgets to rebuild the military stockpiles and so on and so forth. And, you know, unfortunately, I'm not sure we have demonstrated that urgency, at least, you know, as far as I can tell right now. So the challenges that we have are quite profound. But, you know, the United States always sort of wakes up when, as, you know, Churchill once said, you know, with great elegance, you can trust the United States to do the right thing after it has, you know, run out of all other alternatives, right? So I am confident that this will be a wake-up call. And this wake-up call hopefully will lead us to make some purposeful decisions with respect to playing the role that we have set for ourselves, which is to preserve a liberal international order that serves our security interests and the interests of our friends. And in that context, I think the partnership with India will become increasingly important, as both Lisa and Mohan pointed out. But we will have to do much more to strengthen that partnership in precisely the ways that the Russians did for India over the last 30 or 40 years. And on that count, I would say the jury is still out.
Well, that's a good point to conclude your opening remarks on. You haven't answered the question I posed in the very beginning. Does anybody in the US establishment seriously believe, does anybody in the US establishment seriously feels heartbroken that India has not condemned Russia yet?
I think they do feel heartbroken that India has not condemned Russia. But it is a disjuncture between heart and minds. The heart recognizes that it would have been wonderful if India shared in the West solidarity with respect to condemning Russia. But I think the mind appreciates that India has constraints which cannot be abridged in a short order. I think there is also now an increasing recognition that India too has been very subtly changing its position. From an excess of neutrality in the beginning, India has become much more forthright in telling the Russians more clearly about the risks to the system as a result of Russian action. And that, I think, is something that has cheered the West, that we can still count on India to play the role that everyone was hoping for at the beginning of the crisis.
Well, before I go ahead, we know that this audience, not everybody on this audience, I know a lot of you are experts, but not everybody is either a policy wonk or a nerd. So when Ashley says India's strategic programs, people might wonder, but if the whole discussion is about strategic issues, when Ashley says strategic, it mainly means nuclear and nuclear capable missiles. And particularly in this case, the nuclear powered submarine projects and things like that. So I thought I'll add that just for clarity, Lisa. I thought you were sort of poised to say something.
Yes, thank you. I wanted to comment on this issue of whether the US is heartbroken over India not condemning Russia. I think that's the wrong way to look at it. We often talk about emotional aspects. But here, I think it's strategic, not in the nuclear sense, well, partly in the nuclear sense. But the issue really is not whether India is not going to condemn Russia, but whether India's actions are going to actually help Russia achieve its goals, which we, of course, don't want. And we also don't want India setting a negative example for other countries. I mean, let's face it, the US is looking for support to counter what Russia's trying to do. Russia's trying to disrupt the international order, take over a sovereign country through force. And so it's not so much that, we expected that India would condemn Russia, but I think we do expect, since we've invested so much in the US-India partnership, we would at least hope that India would not help Russia with its goals. And so I think where some of the disappointment might have come in was more in the commentary. Not necessarily, Indian official statements, but there was a lot of commentary at the outbreak of the war that, this is the US's fault. Some of it sounded like statements that, Russia was making. So I think that's where some of the disappointment comes in, is that, it's not so much that the US even expects India to condemn Russia at the UN General Assembly or Security Council, but just rather that at least India would, do no harm, that its policies would not help Russia in upending the global order.
Well, all I'd add to that is that I can speak for the Indian commentariat, because for better or worse, I'm a part of it also. Don't take Indian commentariat so seriously when even government of India doesn't. It's very flattering that people in Washington will take people who write or speak, or what I call as a thoughter community, people who've thought everything through seriously. I can promise you that nobody in the new Lutyens Delhi does that anymore. Starting with our Prime Minister, sadly for us. That said, Ambassador Mohan Kumar raised a very important question. Does Washington have the bandwidth to deal with Europe and Indo-Pacific simultaneously? And before Lisa and Ashley answer this, Ambassador Kumar, do you want to elaborate on that just for a minute?
Yes, thank you very much. I understand what Ashley said in terms of a response to what I said, but he added the jury is out, and he mentioned a number of things which the United States has to do. What I meant by the bandwidth, I have now spent hours poring over the national security strategy and so on. Russia is considered a short-term threat and an immediate threat. And China is viewed as a long-term security challenge, the most important challenge. But there are also issues on which United States is quite keen to cooperate with China, which is climate change, proliferation, transnational crimes. I also saw, despite the hot air and the hullabaloo over Nancy Pelosi visit, the Chinese actually held out an olive branch when Xi Jinping said we should work together. So I'm not suggesting that this nightmarish scenario of G2, which is US and China, a condominium of the international system, will come true. But I do genuinely believe there is a resource problem. There is also an attention problem. The Republicans, by the way, want to question the funding for Ukraine. That is where we are at, as far as the House of Representatives is concerned. I don't know how that will play out. So there is so much of distraction from China. I said long back, and I'm not suggesting I'm a clairvoyant or anything. I said there will be a lot of losers from the war in Ukraine, but there will be one winner, and that is China. I have had no reason to change my opinion so far. So I continue to believe that if something were to, let me put it to you bluntly, Shekhar, since you asked me, supposing China were to do something in Taiwan, are you seriously suggesting to me that United States can maintain the same level of attention, supplies, arms supplies, and diplomatic capital to be spent, because you can't do it without that, and also deal with the outcome from a Chinese intervention, for want of a better word, in Taiwan? My answer would be no. At this point, it's going to be a problem. I know a lot of case studies and planning is being done. So that is what I mean by bandwidth. Two other points, if you allow me, since I have the floor. One is, in the entire independence of India, there is only a brief period during which there was a Sino-Russian rapprochement. Very briefly, just after independence, if I'm not mistaken, for 8 to 10 years, when it didn't matter. But the Sino-Russian, which I think Ashley referred to, is a very, very serious issue for India. Both are neighbors, and increasingly, if Russia finds itself as a junior partner to China, then I worry about, during Ladakh, the Russians were able to make uninterrupted supplies. Can they do it the next time? I don't know. What about the SAM missiles, for which we are getting a waiver from the US? So those, I think, will be up in the air, and I think we need to think further. I'm entirely in agreement with Ashley, after listening especially to the retired generals, that the sudden replacement of Russia as a key military supplier is very, very difficult, not just for cost. I think the sheer way in which we have allowed one country to penetrate the arms supplies, the spare parts, the training of people who are, important to operate this equipment. I went and visited the factory in Avadi near Madras. While we make the tanks, there are 8 critical parts that come from Russia. This is 2021. 8 critical. So we don't make a tank. And that's a very sorry state of affairs, frankly. We still depend on critical parts from Russia. So I think there are lots of issues there. But I still maintain that the Russian war in Ukraine could not have come at a worse time for India in the Indo-Pacific. That's what I will submit to you.
Well, I'd add to this that when veterans tell you 20 years, it doesn't mean that no change will come until 20 years. It means there will be change every month, and change is already taking place. So change will keep taking place. And by the end of 20 years, maybe the dependence, if at all, will be very little. That's one. That said, at this point, if you look at Indian Armed Forces, 95% plus tanks are of Russian/Soviet origin. 100% of infantry fighting vehicles are Russian origin. 72% of combat aircraft, the flagship of the Navy, practically all of the Navy's missiles. So the dependence is quite large, and that's also because very little else was available in the past. But I think the emphasis right now is to do joint production in India. How much genuine technology transfer takes place, I don't know. You just said that we can't make these tanks on our own. But let me just throw it open to all three of you. If India has to look at a 20-year time frame after the war in Ukraine, because at some point the war will end. At some point, a post-war Russia will emerge. Now, on this panel, there is a difference of opinion, which is a healthy thing. One panelist thinks that this will leave China much stronger. Someone else might believe that no, China will be weaker because China's most powerful ally or ally in progress would have been devastated after this. There are also those who believe that this has pretty much finished BRI. That Putin has finished BRI, because Putin as a friend has caused such a problem for India. He's caused a bigger problem for China. So let's debate these issues a bit. Where does India go now, and how does India look? How does the world look at a post-war balance of power, and how does India look at the future, particularly in terms of its military equipment?
Yeah, I can jump in here.
Sure.
I don't think it's a clear-cut case that China is going to benefit on all fronts from this war. And, here I'm thinking about Europe's position. And if there's one thing that Russia's invasion of Ukraine has done, I think it's caused the European countries to see the China challenge more through the US lens, in that they did not expect that Russia was going to actually invade Ukraine. So now there's a feeling that they need to, stay on their toes and be aware of what China is doing in the Indo-Pacific, because China could certainly do something similar in the Indo-Pacific. And so the European countries recognize that they want to contribute to deterring China in the Indo-Pacific. The question is, how do they do that? What are some ways they can help deter China? Because they're certainly not going to be deploying, large-scale military assets in the Indo-Pacific. That is not happening. We need them to focus on building up their militaries for Europe, and they're even behind on that front. But doing things in the region on trade, technology, supply chains, maritime security, all of these issues will help. And I think we are seeing renewed interest from Europe, and just looking at China with more the skeptical approach. So I think that, that is not to China's benefit. So I think Russia's aggression has caused them some problems with Europe. But I think I have a slightly different perspective on, I think Ashley in his remarks talked about that Europe, didn't do a good job of integrating Russia. I'm not so sure that that is on the Europeans and the United States. We have to remember there was a G8 at one time that included Russia, but it was really, starting in 2008 with Russia's aggression in Georgia, 2014 in the Crimea. And in fact, some people say that the Obama administration should have reacted more firmly to Russian aggression in the Crimea back in 2014. And, maybe we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. But I do think that, Russia miscalculated. I think he did think US political will was weak because of the disastrous withdrawal in Afghanistan. He didn't think that Zelensky would be as strong of a leader as he's been. And I think he thought the strength of the European-US alliance was decreasing. But, we've shown that, in fact, the alliance is still very strong. So I think the good news is China sees all of these points, and China now has to calculate that into its strategy toward Taiwan, for example. It has to factor, are the Taiwan people going to stand up like the Ukrainian people are standing up to Russian aggression? Will, Europe, will it impact their trade with Europe? So I think in that sense, there have been many things that China would now have to take into account that perhaps it wasn't sure about. But now I think that we have shown some lessons that will have a more positive impact in terms of giving China pause if it wants to take an aggressive action in the Indo-Pacific. So yeah, but in terms of the defense reliance on Russia, I think the United States understands, we understand that, there has been a military alliance built up over many years, and it's going to take a long time for this shift to come. I think there is understanding on that. And there's understanding that even in the sort of larger strategic sense, that India must tread very carefully. The last thing India wants is a China, Russia, Pakistan alliance facing it in the region. So even though, I've talked about some disappointment in the US, I think there's a lot of understanding. And really, I think it's a testament to how strong the foundations of the US-India partnership are, that there really hasn't been an impact on the US-India relationship, even though we have such divergent positions on Russia.
Ashley?
I think the question of whether China comes out uniformly ahead, really requires sort of more granular understanding. I mean, I don't think you can make broad generalizations whether that comes out ahead or not, but I would just point to two things. The fact that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has now triggered a US rethinking about what the global economic order ought to look like must be frightening to anyone in Beijing. Because as Mohan pointed out, China's success over the last 30 years was built on the foundation of an open international order structured on the WTO. If we are now moving to a world, and this was already coming even before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, trade has essentially become weaponized. And if we are moving to a world where essentially we are going to have disjointed trading regimes, and you cannot count on open access to Western markets, and you're China, I think you need to sort of think carefully about the consequences. So there is going to be a huge impact on China simply in the economic realm, and for many others, I would say, and for many others. The second is also on the strategic. If Ukraine turns out to be a wake-up call for the United States in terms of decisions about resource mobilization, in terms of actually, getting together a defense budget that makes sense, and more importantly, a defense strategy that makes sense, and I'll say a word about that in a second, then that too, puts the Chinese in a very awkward position, and they actually come out worse than they were before this crisis. Now, what would be the test? And I think Mohan and I have been sort of addressing this issue in different ways. To me, the test is going to be at the level of defense strategy, whether the US holds on to what is currently its, one power standard or a two power standard. You remember the debates that the Royal Navy had in the interwar period, which is how do we size up our forces? Do we size up our forces against one adversary or against two? That was the one power versus two power standard. And throughout the latter part of the Cold War, the US essentially, planned its capabilities for fighting two campaigns simultaneously. After the Cold War, we evolved in the direction of thinking of just one campaign because there was no other one to think about. We still have a defense budget that is premised on the idea that we will have only one campaign. And the fact is, if you are serious about dealing with the China threat at a time when the Russia threat is not going away, because even whatever happens in Ukraine, Russia is not going to disappear as a country. Russia is not going to disappear as a huge landmass with regenerative capabilities at some level, right? Enough to give its neighbors pause. So if that is all true, then I'm not sure we will have the luxury of having just a single campaign strategy. And so when I talked about the jury being out, I want to see exactly what lessons we draw from this, beyond all the rhetorical flourishes. We've got lots of rhetorical flourishes. But how is this going to be translated in terms of actual capability build up and so on and so forth? I still think, we have to wait and see.
Do we have any questions, Vibha? Are you monitoring questions or?
Yeah, so I put the questions in the chat box.
How do I find it? Can you?
So just go to the chat.
One thing, I think my screen changed its shape a little bit. It's in a new avatar, right? All of a sudden.
I'll message you.
No. I've got help. All right. So question number one to everyone. But if everyone answers, that will be one question only. So any of you can answer this. Impact of the event on the Indo-Pacific policies of EU as a bloc and individual countries of the bloc. And UK. I mean, we can also think of Germany before the coup or after the coup.
No, if I may, I think there is no question in my mind that Lisa is right. EU has woken up in very significant ways to the China threat. After the Russian intervention in Ukraine, they've woken up to the Russian threat as well. But if I'm saying the US does not have bandwidth, then the EU has even lesser bandwidth to deal with Russia and China. That's a no-brainer. So that's the point. I mean, I've spoken to people in the commission. They're not exactly thrilled that the German chancellor takes a gang of people from Siemens and Mercedes-Benz and goes to China. And then, of course, he says, I raised all the tough things with him privately. Maybe he has. But I think, frankly, the EU today is what the Russian war in Ukraine has done has delayed the emergence of EU as an independent pole in the multipolar system. I said that, and that's a great regret for India, by the way. I'm not saying this with any schadenfreude, because India wants EU as a pole. We prefer a multipolar system in which EU occupies its legitimate pole. I'm afraid that particular thing has now been delayed by several years.
Yes.
Can I add one thought to that, Shekhar?
Yeah.
When you think of the EU, right? I mean, you start off with the fact that this is still an organization in evolution. It is by no means a replacement for any of the major states in Europe. It doesn't have the capabilities of a major state. So in some sense, what the EU does is important, but is not transformative in terms of European policy. The national centers are still the key units of action which drive all policies in the area of national security. Now think about the contradiction that all the major European states face. For years, they were very comfortable with the world where they enjoyed Chinese markets, Russian energy, and European security. Now, they are struggling with the reality that Russian energy will not be out there. They want the United States to stay engaged in their security at a time when we are finding it harder and harder to do so. And they have simply been unable to rid themselves of the addiction to Chinese markets. Now, we have to sort of be realistic here. The Chinese market is a huge driver of European growth. And I do not see the Europeans seeing the Chinese threat in exactly the same terms that the US does. And therefore, even while they express our solidarity with the United States and will make adjustments in their defense policies, I don't see a rush in Europe to think of China as, you know, the second coming of the Third Reich. So you are going to see a European response that is highly fragmented, a European response that is going to do its damnedest to protect its economic equities in China, even as they join with the United States in curtailing Chinese access to some advanced technologies. And that is the uncomfortable reality that we are going to have to learn to live with, that the broad patterns of European trade with China will persist, even if there are constraints with respect to certain segments of trade. And that is going to put them in a very awkward position politically when they have to deal with Chinese geopolitics.
So I have a
I can read your face. You want to say something?
Yes. So I have a slightly different perspective again, but I guess this is good for a panel. So yeah, okay, there is still a lot of trade happening with China, even with India-China trade, that's going up. Despite India taking some steps on strategic sectors, not allowing Chinese companies to come in for the 5G trials, banning apps. So we're seeing different patterns develop. And this is, again, you know, this is not necessarily in China's interest. I mean, we're kind of in a new ball game here. So we're kind of seeing what plays out. You know, the U.S. Crippling China's semiconductor industry, you know, that was a pretty big deal. So I guess the point that I'd like to make is, even though, yes, we do need to step up on the defense front, Europe needs to step up on the defense front, we do have other tools at our disposal to try to shape the global order and the Indo-Pacific order specifically. And it comes down to the trade, the technology, the supply chains, and what we can do together on that front. So I'm a little bit more optimistic that the US and Europe will be able to develop strategies that will not allow China to use its trading relationships to coerce other countries on political issues or strategic issues. I think that's the crux of the issue. We may continue, the trading relationships, the economic engagement with China, but the key is to not allow China to use those trade relationships to coerce other countries politically. And so maybe we need to think about mechanisms that curtail China's ability to do that. And I think, Australia was victim of this economic coercion. South Korea has been in the past, Lithuania, other countries. And so the key is to not allow China to be able to do that. And if we're going to do that, we have to come together. We have to work together. We have to see the threat in the same way. And that takes constant attention, constant conversations and coordination. But I think that's how we should look at it. Not necessarily that trade with China is always going to benefit China. It's how we shape how China is dealing with the rest of the world. And that's when it comes back to standing up to Russian aggression becomes extremely important as an example to China, that the international community is not going to stand for territorial aggression.
We just have a few minutes left. I'll try and squeeze in 2 questions if I can, but let me also tell you to cheer us all up that we have like a sold out session with 1,200 people watching us simultaneously. So we better be careful about what we are saying. We've got a real audience and smart audience. Thank you very much for being there. Now, the audience, I said that. Now, the question, what will be the impact of the event on the Quad and its future work? I know that some of it's been discussed. Lisa spoke about it a fair bit in the very beginning, but does anybody want to add anything to that impact on the Quad?
No question that I expect activities in the framework of Quad to intensify further.
Yeah.
Very briefly.
Yeah, and when do the partners start being less shy about the defense or the military aspect of the Quad?
There's only one partner that's relevant to that conversation, Shekhar.
When do you guess? Oh, okay. Let me unclutter it. When do you expect or hope India will start talking about it in military terms?
I think India shied away from that because it wants to still communicate to the Chinese that they are not part of any anti-China military coalition in Asia. And so they want to keep the Quad as a mechanism for dealing with broader issues than just the challenges of military balancing. My expectation is that they will increase their activity with the Quad in the military space, but will never cross certain important thresholds, which will be reserved purely for the bilateral relationships between the Quad members. So that way, India can still uphold the fiction that the Quad is not an anti-China alliance. It's not an Asian NATO in the making, even as India doubles down on the bilateral defense ties with the United States, Japan, and Australia. And I think that is going to be the Brahmanical solution to keeping the Quad active, but without appearing as a military avatar.
Well, after all, we are the land that invented the peaceful nuclear explosion. So we can do more innovative things. Lisa, you have a point to add on this?
Yeah, I think that the Quad, even though they're not dealing with military security issues, I mean, of course, you have the Malabar exercises that now are regularly going to include Australia in addition to US, Japan, and India. But in terms of Quad working groups, they're all, focused on issues like vaccines and public health, technology, climate change, space, all non-military, non-defense activity, but they're still strategic, right? It comes back to the point I made previously that we're trying to shape this global order in a way that maintains, sovereign country sovereignty, that countries have choices, they're not overly reliant on one country, that there are free and open seaways. So I think the Quad activities are, genuinely helping to shape that order that we are striving for, and that all four countries have a vision for. I think whether or not the Quad, ventures over into military and defense activities really depends on what China does. If, we see more maritime aggression, more aggression against Taiwan, if there's a lot of concern that there could be conflict, that will prompt the Quad probably to increase its defense and security cooperation. And so really what we're doing now, what we're seeing is the Quad is building these habits of cooperation on other issues, but could quickly translate that into military cooperation if they had to, if there was a need or a requirement to do so.
Lisa, at one point you had mentioned the prospect of a China-Russia-Pakistan alliance. You think that's realistic, or what that just a rhetorical point?
Yeah, I don't personally see that happening anytime soon. But I think it is a point that Indians have raised as a concern. So it's more, something that it would be very far out there, but I suppose it's a reason for India not to, completely alienate Russia. But I don't think anybody expects that India is planning to, completely alienate Russia in the near future. So it's sort of one of these extreme, not very likely, but extreme, what do they call it? High impact, low probability situations.
Well, I think I know that everybody has more points to make, but this is our time's up. And thank you very much. This has been a wonderfully civilized and enlightening discussion. I've learned a lot from it. And you know what? If we put it on the TRP count, then this is a big bore compared to what passes off for discussions on our TV channels these days. So that will be very unexciting. But if it's 100th as exciting or 100 times as unexciting, it's 100 times more enlightening. And nothing's been broken. So may there be more such conversation. I am so privileged to have moderated it, enabled it, or facilitated it. So thank you very much for being there. And thank you, the audience, 1,200 people, Friday evening. Fantastic. I know we are all rock stars.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.